I will introduce our speaker for tonight, Professor David Griffiths. David is a professor at the University of Oxford. He's trained in both the UK and Scandinavia, completing field and research projects on parts of the Irish Sea region, Orkney, and Oxfordshire. David has been working on Scottish archaeological themes since the mid-1980s and has published works on coastal archaeology and medieval settlement. And in 2013, he gave the Whithorn Lecture. He is a visiting professor at the University of the Highlands and Islands Northern Studies, and was formerly a visiting fellow at the University of Glasgow and an external examiner at the University of Aberdeen. He's also a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. Tonight, David will discuss how the Irish Sea zone was an intense area of Viking activity between the 8th and 11th centuries, which is the topic of his updated publication, Vikings of the Irish Sea. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to David.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Thank you.
Okay, I've just left this. I'll come to this slide in a minute. I'll go to the actual title slide. Oh, my PowerPoint seems to have gone to sleep. There we go. There we go. It's back on again now. So thank you for the opportunity to talk to the Scottish Society for Northern Studies and to Claire Downham, who was the person who invited me, I think, in the first place. I've had a very good working relationship with Claire. We've recently organised a major conference called the Viking Congress at Liverpool in 2022, together with 2 other colleagues, and that's on its way to publication now. So, I mean, some of these themes I'll be running through kind of impinge on that a bit, and it's worth just having a look at what the Irish Sea is. Why is this an area of interest? Why talk about Vikings on something wet when normally they, most of the evidence comes from the land around it? And historically, of course, the history of the Vikings has been seen in the context of national narratives. So you've had the Vikings in Ireland. There's a whole load of books on that. Slightly fewer on the Isle of Man or Wales. Some generally talk about England, but the northwest of England, which is the bit, well, there's a bit of the southwest that borders the Irish Sea as well. Let me not forget to mention that, around Bristol and the Bristol Channel. But these areas tend to be slightly pushed to one side by what's going on in York and East Anglia and places. And it's been an area of interesting, but slightly peripheral research over the years. And when I was doing my PhD, I actually come from the Wirral, which is on the map. If you can see my mouse here, there it is, there, just across the water from Liverpool. And it was just living by the sea as a young person growing up that kind of made me think, what happened here in what we used to call the Dark Ages, what lay over the horizon. And of course the Irish Sea is a very small sea by world geographic standards, so you can almost see across it, and I'll come to this as well, the visibility question. But from the Wirral, if you stand on slightly higher ground, you can see an arc of the Irish Sea from Anglesey right over to Cumbria. I've never seen the Isle of Man with my naked eyes from the Wirral. Some people claim to have done so, but it's just a bit too far over the curvature of the earth. And it's a sea which it's quite intimidating to sail. I've got quite a bit of sailing experience, and this vessel that you see on the front slide here was built in Denmark in the early 2000s. It's a like-for-like replica of one of the Skuld ships, which was found in the 1960s in a fjord near Roskilde, and a large warship. And it took many decades for the wood to be examined in sufficient detail to find out that the original wasn't built in Denmark, it was built in Ireland, somewhere near Dublin. And we know from the Irish sources that there were fleets in early medieval Ireland, not just owned by the Vikings, actually, owned by some of the Irish high kings as well. And this is a wonderful example of the connectivity of the Viking world and how big a role the Irish Sea played in it, because Dublin is I think one of the leading centres of economic and political activity in the entire Viking world. And to some extent, it dominated the Irish Sea, but there's an awful lot more going on in the Irish Sea than just at Dublin. But it is kind of the nodal point of a lot of the activity. So this vessel was going around the north of Scotland in 2007 on its way to Dublin. I've seen the videos of people on board. It was a pretty terrifying voyage, actually, that at one point they were in some danger. There was such rough sea. And it makes you think, how did people get on in the Viking Age? Because in the modern era, we've got, radar, telecommunications, there are rescue services. None of that existed in the Viking period. And I think a lot of these ships must have been lost, but they also had a knowledge that it was extremely detailed about the ways in which you could navigate the seas of Western and Northern Europe, and an ability to sail these vessels that we almost entirely lack today, despite the fact that wonderful museums like Roskilde have really tried to find it again. I mean, that innate sort of lived ability to sail one of these vessels is something that is incredibly demanding. And of course, they went all the way to Iceland, Greenland, and ultimately North America. So in that context, the Irish Sea is not too far away from their home stamping grounds. And as I was interested in this topic, it sort of partly informed my PhD thesis. And I published a book in 2010 called Vikings of the Irish Sea. That's done fairly well over the years in terms of sales. A lot of people have complimented me on it. And it's recently been republished by the History Press with some additions and tweaks. There have been some more discoveries in the last 15 years, and they're now embedded in the text. So I just put that up there as an invitation to you perhaps to have a think about it and maybe go and buy a copy. But let's have a look at the Irish Sea. Where the sea and land start and finish is entirely a product of huge geological and natural environmental forces. The sea, of course, rises up and down over time. And at some point, probably in the Mesolithic, the Irish Sea was probably just a deep but narrow channel between the Isle of Man and Anglesey and Ireland. As you can see here, the darker blue on the map is the deeper parts of the Irish Sea leading down to St George's Channel, which opens up into the Celtic Sea and the Atlantic. The North Channel is quite a deep part of the Irish Sea, but it's the bit that separates Ireland from Scotland. But it's very narrow as well. In fact, I'm sure many of you have been to Galway or Kintyre or Islay, and you can easily see Ulster across the water. It's absolutely as clear as anything, except on a very foggy day. And the thought that people would have been tempted, even in very early times, to cross this, despite the currents and the natural hazards, is something that we can imagine was probably the case. The Isle of Man geologically belongs to the British side of the Irish Sea, as you can see, but it's really in the centre of the sea. And the Lancashire coast between Liverpool and Carlisle is much shallower, and you have these very big broad estuaries like Morecambe Bay, which are navigable, but they're very, very heavily tidal, and you need a lot of local knowledge to get in and out of those. So this is the zone of interest. I prefer to call it a region, really, rather than the zone, the Irish Sea region. And it brings together all of the national stories of the different countries and nations around it. And that's how I sought to write the book, is putting the sea at the centre and really putting the Vikings with their aptitude for navigation and sea kind of craft at the centre of the story. And the national stories differ quite interestingly around. I mean, the Vikings are very unpopular in Ireland until about 50 years ago, and they've suddenly risen up in Irish culture now is a great thing, and there's wonderful museum displays, but some generations ago they were seen as perhaps detracting from the Irish story, and they were known as the foreigners, which goes back to the Irish annals at the time. So you have this group of people coming in, and they were known in Ireland as the foreigners. And they come into Wales, they come into Northwest England, they come into Scotland, and they engage and fight, but also bargain and get married to, and have arrangements with the local populations. And it's not just a story of battles and defeats. It's a story of engagement, it's a story of negotiation, and it's a story of cultural change. Here's some nice imagery to give you the full picture of visibility. This is the Isle of Man, seen from the Isle of Whithorn. So the Isle of Whithorn's on the tip of, near the tip of Galloway. It's not quite the furthest tip out. That's the Mull of Galloway. It's on the Machars. I'm sure many people know this. And I dug at the excavations at Whithorn in the 1980s. And then many years later was very proud to be invited to give the Whithorn lecture, which again picked up the Irish Sea theme. And this picture was provided to me at the time by one of the Whithorn lecture people. Quite clearly see the Isle of Man. It's much closer to southern Scotland than it is to northern England, actually. But you can see it from Cumbria, and you can see it from the tip of North Wales, from Anglesey. Bit of rudimentary view shedding here. Very simple map on the left just to show the scope of what you can see at sea level. And on the right is a map done by Vicky Cummings and Chris Fowler, who are Neolithic specialists. And they took the mountain tops as their starting point for this. And it is a well-known fact that from Snaefell, which is the highest hill or mountain on the Isle of Man, on a clear day, you can see the full circuit of mountains around the Irish Sea. You know, the tops of the lakes of Snowdonia and of the Mournes in Ireland in particular. And it's quite clearly visible to southwest Scotland. But people don't navigate from the tops of mountains. They navigate in boats from sea level. It's much harder to see the way ahead if you're at sea level. So really there would have to be a series of visual connections, and this is how the sea is normally navigated. You have to be aware of the tides and prevailing winds, which can set you well off course if you don't know how to respond to those. But really, you're looking for something ahead and keeping stuff in sight astern, and then slowly there's a very small patch of sea where you can't see anything. But if you keep going in the same direction, you'll pick up the land ahead. And this is how I've sailed on the Irish Sea with my dad in former times. We had a boat many years ago which had no navigational aids whatsoever, and we managed to get across the Irish Sea in that. And nowadays, of course, you've got lots of technology to help you. I mean, the hazards are mainly around the flatter and more dangerous entry points to the estuaries, and particularly if the wind blows up quite nastily, you can be in quite a lot of trouble. And there must have been many shipwrecks at this time, because we know there were many shipwrecks in Victorian times, so they can't not have been in the Viking Age. But nonetheless, it became quite a regular route, and it had been pioneered millennia before. These are some of the examples of Neolithic rock art or stone art that you can see around the Irish Sea, and the Neolithic archaeologists have long known that they have a great deal in common. There's Newgrange, Kilmartin, etc., this spiral art, and it led to the famous archaeologist Gordon Childe remarking that the Irish Sea, the grey waters of the Irish Sea must have been busy with Neolithic Argonauts, and that's really referring to the Neolithic or later Stone Age. That's 3000 BC or thereabouts. So since then, there must have been yet more in the Iron Age, and of course the Roman period. And one of the odder things about the Irish Sea is that the Romans never tried, as far as we know, tried to conquer Ireland. Some people argue they had a plan to do so, but it never came off. There is, however, quite a bit of Roman material culture in Ireland, especially in places like Newgrange, where it seems to have been deposited in a somewhat ritualistic way. And the Romans, they never really went too far beyond the Antonine Wall in terms of outright conquest, although they had watch stations in central Scotland. So their ambitions didn't extend to the full picture, but there was no doubt that there must have been lots of traffic around the Irish Sea in the Roman period. And as the Roman Empire declined and went into collapse in the 5th century, even before that, there was certainly known to be raiding in the Irish Sea, and some of the later Roman forts around the Irish Sea coast at Cardiff, Holyhead and Lancaster were built in the later Roman Empire to counteract the dangers from raiding in the Irish Sea. So this idea that the Irish Sea raiding was somehow new in the Viking Age is wrong. In fact, there was a violent and pretty divisive political culture all the way through the classical and early historic period, and many of the political structures in their smaller and more warring states were really knocking 7 bells out of each other. If you read the Irish annals, you see loads of people being massacred and murdered in Ireland even before the Viking period. So violence was nothing new in the Viking period. And the idea of playing off forces against each other, buying your way into favour, all that kind of thing was already there. Another aspect of this is the way that people have tried to, not tried, they've succeeded in many ways to bring the sea forward as an aspect of historical and archaeological writing. These 2 books I found inspiring. They seem rather old now. No doubt my work will seem rather old before too long. But they were an attempt to look at the Western Seaways, the Irish Sea, and its general area as a connective zone of contact. Part of, I guess, the 1960s and 70s era of increasing emphasis on geography and archaeology. And Bowen's book, looks at the saints and the way that religion moved around. And the Irish Sea Province in Archaeology and History had a whole series of papers from different eras working on the Irish Sea, one of which by Peter Sawyer was on the Viking Age. It was quite historical. It's taken many years since to assemble the archaeological counterpart to that. Was it a province? Well, I don't use the word province, so I'm not sure what it means actually. Sometimes people call it a culture province. I'm not quite sure what the meaning of that would be, so I just stick to the geographic word region. But there was certainly trade before the Viking Age in the Irish Sea. These 2 maps show Eware pottery on the left, Charles Thomas's map, and type G penannular brooches, which is quite a well-known, if somewhat small and mundane type of metalwork which circulated in Britain before the Viking Age, really. There are concentrations of brooches in certain coastal areas, including around Liverpool Bay and in southern Scotland and to some extent in Northern Ireland. But the Eware, which is a type of pottery sourced in Western France, is perhaps a better known and more remarked upon phenomenon. This is part of a picture of trade which had been coming up from the Western Mediterranean and Iberia, the Bay of Biscay for many centuries, and there's a whole load of late Roman and early post-Roman pottery coming into Tintagel and places like that. The Eware is a little bit later, and it's a kind of Gaulish, we're not quite sure what was transported in it, but it may be connected to the spread of early Christianity. And Charles Thomas has put, you'll see the arrows here, these are the ports of entry into Ireland particularly, but there's also, it's found in Dunad, which is in Argyll, in Dalriata, and various important sites in the southwest of Scotland, the Isle of Man, and there's a small group in Pembrokeshire as well. So clearly the Western Seaways were very important in the pre-Viking period, and the emphasis at this time is on trade and influence coming from the south. Everything was coming up. And if you believe the traditional view, when we get to the Viking Age, it all starts coming down from the north, from the top. And I'm just going to invite you to question that a little bit in a second. We first hear about our good old friends, the Vikings, who are not called Vikings, actually. They're called Gentiles, foreigners, often called heathen. This is the thing that sets them apart, is their pagan religion. And the first raid that we know of in the Irish Sea region proper was in 795, and it was on an island called Rechru, as spelt in Old Irish in the Annals of Ulster. And there are actually two candidates for where this might have been. Rathlin, which is off the coast of northeast Ireland, off Ulster, County Antrim, could well be Rechru. I think most people would say it probably was. That's a candidate for it. There's Lambay, which also has Rechran in its name and in its early name, and it belongs to a parish that has a portion of the mainland that's called Portran today. It's a smaller island, but it's nearer to Dublin, whether Dublin was really a focus at that time. Really, the Viking settlement in Dublin is a little bit later, but this could just as easily be the site of the first raid. Both have an early Christian monastic presence on them. Rathlin has started to produce some quite interesting graves, so maybe that ups its candidature. I think we'll ever know, actually, because all of the archaeology is a bit later and it would require a bit of a settled presence. A hit and run raid, people have desperately tried to find the very well-known site of the raid on Lindisfarne, and it's really hard to find the scene of destruction, because archaeology is very good at giving you things that have been created, and occasionally you can find things that have been destroyed if there's a good burning layer or something like that. But the accounts of Lindisfarne don't actually say that the church was burnt. It was despoiled and people were killed. At the same time, Iona is raided, and a little bit later in 798, this place Home Patrick, or Innis Patrick, which is an interesting place. Again, it's a portion of the mainland just north of Lambay on the County Dublin coast, and it's got these little skerries offshore. What was that all about? Why would you raid these tiny skerries? I mean, surely it must have been the mainland that was the target. Iona, of course, a great monastery, the Columban Monastery of Dalriata, very strong Irish links, very proudly sort of viewed as Scotland's greatest monastic site. But actually, the time could almost be seen as part of Ireland, insofar as either of these two nations existed in their modern form. Certainly, its ecclesiastical links are very strongly with Ireland, and it spawned the offshoot at Kells a little bit later in the early 9th century. Was it the first place to be raided, or in fact did it form a pattern coming from the south? Was Rathlin and Iona and some of the other sites along the east coast of Ireland, did they fit together in a manner which would suggest that the impetus was coming from the south? One of the interesting comments about the Innis Patrick, Home Patrick raid, was that the heathens took cattle tribute. Now, if it was a few boats crunching up on the beach with a bit of slaughter and shouting and grabbing a few gold objects, you wouldn't expect something like cattle tribute to be part of the picture. Even at this early stage, this suggests that whoever was raiding this area was engaged in some significant negotiation, or at least communication, with the people already living there. There's some sort of bargaining being done here, even if it was done in an extortionate way by the incomers. I've argued, I won't bore you with this too much, but I have published work which suggests actually that the impetus at the very start of the Viking Age was around the English Channel and the collapsing urban economies of Dorstad and Quentivik. The Carolingian Empire was going into difficulty in the early 9th century. heard a lot of the impetus for the early raids be coming through the Channel, perhaps the Bay of Biscay, where the Vikings are known to have been active very early on, actually. The first known Viking incident, let's call it an incident rather than the raid, in Britain was in 789, and it was in Dorset. And we think it's probably at Portland, although that is conveyed by a slightly later source, where ships of the Northmen from Hordaland is Western Norway up here, were engaged in a fracas on the beach with the Reeve of Wessex, who was killed. And this is the first hint that there's something quite nasty about to take place. But this was right in the very south of Britain, as far south as you can go. So the logical steps that I was taught at university, that they must have gone to Shetland and Orkney first, and then taken, logical steps down towards the rest of the of Britain, and eventually round to Ireland, perhaps around by the Hebrides. You just need to question that bit. That's all I'm saying. And there are other possibilities. And this could help us to understand the way in which the Viking pattern of activity in the North Atlantic developed, because they, we hear in some sources that Norwegians went straight there to the Faroes and over to Iceland, but we know from our genetic work that a substantial proportion of the people of Iceland and the North Atlantic territories have genetic heritage that's associated with Ireland and perhaps Britain as well. How did these people get involved? Where did the impetus come from? That little yellow mark is the later Norwegian. This is when things get consolidated into political structures, the earldom of Orkney, which I've argued is a bit of a later development, and that history has been rewritten to kind of fit that picture, I think. So let's move on. Here are some of the articles. This very nice book on Viking Age in Scotland that was produced a couple of years ago, mainly talking about Orkney and that, and my work in Orkney, but it does impinge on this question of, because I see in many ways the Viking influence in Orkney as having an Irish component. There's no doubt that it does. It may even be quite a dominant component at one point. Let you think about that. Here's our perhaps favourite image of a Viking raid. This is the hostage stone from Inchmarnock in the Firth of Clyde, found in two parts in two separate seasons. So I would love to have been the person who found either part, but the person who found the second half must have been over the moon. Here is a mailed warrior with a very fancy headdress or hairstyle, which we know that the Vikings were described as having. There's a ship here with, if you were going to draw a Viking ship on a piece of slate, then you'd come up with that, really, wouldn't you? And over here is someone dressed rather differently, not in armor, in chains, who's being led towards this, it would seem, unless all these images are separate, which some people perhaps rather boringly have suggested. It does seem to be a scene, and the person on the left is holding something that looks a bit like one of Mrs. Thatcher's handbags, but actually is probably a house-shaped shrine. Perhaps was this at someone's religious standing, we know that prelates and priests and monks were captured and turned into hostages by the Vikings. It's a wonderful scene. And in Ireland, quite quickly in the 9th century, we start to get an overwintering presence. And these are some of the so-called long forts, or Longfoot in the plural, ship fortresses, which some of which are quite clear and definite. And Dublin's is by far the biggest one. It's a rather lovely drawing of what Dublin may have looked like in the early Viking Age, although I think we now think there's probably a lot more happening on this side of the little river called the Poddle that comes into the River Liffey. This is the River Liffey, not the open sea. So this is where the river in Dublin is today, somewhat further out than the coastline shown here because of land reclamation. And you can see the probable site of the ship fortress or long fort that historically was found in 841. So that's quite late, actually. It's decades after the first raids. But there are hints of maybe earlier activity here, and you can't always be certain that the history is telling you the full picture. Could there be something here from the very early 9th, and perhaps even the late 8th century. Some of the burials have produced radiocarbon dates, but I think there are scientific reasons to be suspect about that, which seem to hint at this very early date of occupation. Certainly became a very, very big and important town in the 10th century. The other long forts are not in quite such an urban and built up situation. We have some excellent evidence from Woodstown, right down in the southeast of Ireland, which is a rural site now, but that's produced evidence of occupation in the 9th century. There's also a Viking grave there, just one by the entrance, but that's important because these ship fortresses do seem to be associated with pagan burial. The one at Annagassan was not understood well until a few years ago. A team went in and did some excavation on the peninsula that comes down to the little ring fort at Linz, and it seems that the entire peninsula was fortified. There was supposed to have been a monastery there. That's not really been fully identified, but there are hints of it perhaps in the same position as what we now think is the site of the Long Fort. On the left there, you can see the little river coming through, and the sea is on the right. So it's a defended peninsula. And the one at Dunrally, which is slightly inland in southeast Ireland, there are historical mentions of that. Ned Kelly, Eamon P. Kelly, has put forward a very strong argument, which people have debated, that this again was a long fort on the River Barrow. There are other candidates around Ireland. I haven't got time to go through them in detail, but this idea that the Vikings were living in fortified riverside fortresses in the 9th century is pretty well accepted, and is paralleled in England by the Great Army with their encampments at places like Torksey and Repton. The burials from around the Irish Sea present a very interesting picture of cultural convergence. Here are some Irish and Cumbrian burials in Lancashire. You'll see these oval brooches are quite often the most kind of recognisable objects. Lots of other stuff in there as well. And when you study burials, you can't just pick out the fancy bits and tell the story around those. You have to look at everything. And these wonderful watercolours of the Kilmainham and Island Bridge cemeteries in Dublin, which were excavated in the early to mid 19th century. And really all we have is the finds now in museum collections, together with some quite sort of intractable mentions from that time. Stephen Harrison and the late Ryan Lafloyne did a massive book on this, so it's all very well documented. I was taught at university, I taught myself perhaps with the literature there at the time, that the Vikings were a colonial force and they were bringing their culture into Britain and Ireland in a kind of conquering way. And actually, this isn't quite meet those specifications. A lot of the material in the graves is not actually from Scandinavia. It's made in Britain or Ireland. In fact, there are types of weapons such as the conical shield boss, which are known as Irish Sea style weapons. A lot of the swords are actually based on Frankish models of sword and decoration. There are some Scandinavian objects, often quite the older style, the ones that have been around for a long time before they were deposited, like these sort of so-called bear dial brooches. And the graves present this wonderful composite of all of the different places that the Vikings had had contact with up until the point they were deposited. And in many cases that this was late 9th or even 10th century, so a century or more after the first raids. The cultural convergence and the difficulty of saying this is Viking or that's not Viking is exemplified by the wonderful Galloway hoard, which is currently on the exhibition in Australia, but was recently in London for the Silk Road. I'm sure many of you have heard the story about this, but it was found by a metal detectorist in 2014 unexpectedly up the River Dee from Kirkcudbright in southwest Scotland. And there was nothing there before the discovery to suggest anything this fantastic was buried there, but later on, there was archaeological work which showed that there is some interest in that particular site. It has two deposits. The upper one is a silver deposit of arm rings and ingots, and the lower one, of course, is the famous urn, this amazing urn, probably from Persia or somewhere around that Persian Gulf area, with these fabulous, a lot of the material is Anglo-Saxon actually. Haven't got time to go into it, but there's some wonderful publications. There's been stuff published on the runes quite recently. Some of the arm rings have runes on them, and these seem to be Anglian runes, not Old Norse. So is this a Viking hoard? Well, the arm rings are perhaps more characteristic of on the left there, of a Viking style object, probably produced in Ireland. And these were in the upper deposit, and the lower deposit was sort of separated by some inches of earth. It's like, so the upper deposit was perhaps a decoy. If you found that, you'd think, yippee, I found some silver, and run away, not realizing that there was something even more amazing. However, the ideology and ritual of hoarding is very complicated, and we can't assume that this was a pure concealment. There may have been other reasons why it was buried there, but it's a fabulous treasure. There's so much in it, but it brings forward this idea that the Vikings were complex and not always performing the same colonial rites of behaviour. Similarly, at the site at Llanbedgoch in Anglesey, this is a settlement site, often spoken of as a Viking settlement, but really the enclosure, I was involved in excavating this for many years in the 1990s. It's Mark Redknapp's project of National Museums Wales. This enclosure that I think we thought at the time was a Viking Age enclosure turns out actually by radiocarbon dating to be quite a bit earlier. So this was already here. And when the Viking material comes in, it's an established site. So it was probably always in Welsh hands, but there's a big admixture of Viking influence and probably Viking people, in the sense that there were merchants or people involved in trade who came here. You'll see the weights, there's hack silver, this rather beautiful whetstone with its little kind of copper helmet on it, perhaps a bit earlier than the Viking period, seems to be some sort of regalia. And we don't have a context for that. It was found in a potato picker. So, few challenges to our thinking. Firstly is how did people navigate this sea? Where did they land? Because just going around in boats isn't enough. You have to land, you have to do something when you get there. You're transporting people and perhaps slaves and traded items across. Where were the reliable harbours? Where did they go? How did that connect to settlement? And who controlled it? You can see a number of the sites I've mentioned here on the map, and I'll come back to some of them in a minute. And then when you have landed, where then did you go? How did the land routes take you to places of importance? For instance, we know that Dublin and York were closely connected dynastically and in every other way. There were dominant urban centres in their respective countries. So how were they connected? And I think there's a good case with York that the most logical route straight across the Pennines from Lancashire is the right way to look at it. But there are other possibilities. How did people inhabit the landscape? How did they get hold of land if they were incomers? How did they leave their presence known in terms of their culture? Where did the food come from, and how did the natural resources play? I think some of the hoards, these great hoards that we find in the Lancashire estuary, so the most famous of all is the Cuerdale hoard, the largest Viking hoard from Britain. And there are other finds which the Portable Antiquities Scheme have found dotted around that help to build a picture of coastal landing places and navigation, perhaps beach markets. Perhaps the hoards were used to purchase land. We do have place names that particularly well-known one is Copeland in Cumbria. Kaupaland means the bought land in Old Norse. Copeland is the southwestern portion of Cumbria. Perhaps, we know from charters in the reigns of Athelstan and so forth that land was being exchanged for money. Amounderness, which is a central part of Lancashire around the Fylde Peninsula, was actually bought by Athelstan himself and given to the Church of York. He says, bought with no little money of my own. Who he bought it from doesn't actually, it's not clear, but there's a remark that it was saved from hateful servitude, which might imply that it's bought from the pagans. So where Vikings buying estates or buying their way into estates, negotiating their way in, and then perhaps passing them on when that became expedient. And who were these people? How did they fit in? How did they leave their mark on the culture of the area? These metalwork finds do strongly imply that there was a lot of similarity in the way that personal ornament was displayed around the Irish Sea. There must have been some people who went round and around and had lots of contacts across the Irish Sea region. And some of the metalworking styles are very reminiscent in Ireland, the Isle of Man, in Cumbria and so forth. The use of Viking art styles is clearly a Scandinavian influence. We have runic inscriptions, very, very wonderful collection from the Isle of Man, for instance. So there's definitely a Scandinavian influence here. There's no doubt about that. When it exactly arrived and how it played out amongst the inhabitants of these areas is quite a complex picture. Place names are another clue to the Viking presence, but they're quite a difficult source to deal with. You can't just assume that if something says it's, explicitly looks like it's a Viking place name, that it denotes the settlement of an early Viking group in that area. I think that's a false assumption, really. You'll see on this map there's an awful lot more of them in northwest England than any other part of the Irish Sea, but very, very few in Wales and Ireland, and a slightly thinner group in Galloway and Dumfriesshire, as quite a dense collection in the Isle of Man. And a lot of the way that place names come through to us in terms of their survival is to do with the way that language develops over the centuries. It's a very complicated area, but kind of sum it up as quickly and as simply as I can. Languages replace other languages. And so Old Norse speakers around Dublin, perhaps there were more of them in the 11th century than there were in the 15th century, and therefore a lot of the place names were lost. There's a handful around Dublin Bay, but what we know archaeologically about the Vikings in Ireland is far greater in extent and importance than the place names would suggest. Similarly in Wales as well, there's a lot more going on there than a handful of place names of Viking stuff, because the Welsh language, was dominant and still is in a lot of Wales, and perhaps the Viking names for settlements were overridden. The interesting thing about Wales is that a lot of the coastal features have both Viking names and Welsh names. So something like the Great Orme, which is a huge headland just off the North Wales coast near Llandudno, is known as the Great Orme in English. That means the Great Serpent, and it looks like a serpent if you see it on the horizon. It's known as Pen y Gogarth in Welsh, which means it's the headland of the Gogarth, which is the area behind it. So the Welsh names are given as if from the land, and the Scandinavian names as if from the sea. I think that's really important. I tried to map what I thought were the early clusters. Some interesting new research being done. Just marked a DPhil, excellent DPhil thesis at Oxford by a chap called Anthony Del Rio, who's used GIS to map PAS finds, place names, and his distribution of what probably amounts to the early Viking presence. He worked on Northumbria, so northwest England. Is a little bit different to mine, but generally similar and very interesting indeed. He's got slightly greater emphasis on things like the Furness Peninsula around Barrow. These are my suggestions that within the great spread of place names, concealed within that, there are earlier clusters. Of course, place names carry on being given. We know that people moved to Cumbria from the Danelaw in the 1090s and brought some of their naming habits with them. And where I come from in the Wirral, there's a whole series of really nice Viking place names. It's always been seen as a Viking enclave. And there's the famous attack on Chester in the early 10th century by Ingemund, a Dublin Viking. The Vikings were kicked out of Dublin in 902, and this person is the only one we know of by name. Ingemund initially settles in Anglesey, but is then booted out by the Welsh, and then makes his way to Mercia, and the nearest bit of Mercia to Anglesey going eastwards is the Wirral or the Dee and Mersey estuaries. And Ingemund decides to have a go at Chester, the English capital of the region, and attacks it. There's this wonderful siege with many kind of apocryphal elements. And by that time, in order to mount such an attack, there must have been a kindred or friendly settlement in the area. And the place names do concentrate quite heavily in the north of the Wirral and in the West Derby Hundred, which is where Liverpool now is. And just across is this wonderful, across the Dee from the Wirral is Minor Quivan, which is a wonderful standing cross still in its original position, with, you know, this dancing warrior you'll see in the lower portion of the cross shaft is hinting at the sort of Viking world, really, although it is a Christian monument. And of course, the religious change is another factor. This is one of our Wirral road signs. Interesting place names, a mixture of Old Norse, Old English, are also British or Old Welsh place names in the Wirral. Mells, which is a coastal trading site I did a big project on, that means sandhills in Old Norse, Mella. My favourite one here is probably Greasby, because it looks like a Viking name, doesn't it? BY, standard Anglo-Scandinavian farmstead. But it's actually in the Domesday Book, in the Cheshire Domesday, is Gravesbury. So it was an English name in the 11th century, and it's become, by repetition and by the local vernacular, converted to what looks like an Old Norse name in the Middle Ages. And that should caution you against believing what you see when you see a BY name. You should look at the wonderful publications of Gillian Fellows Jensen and others who actually can tell you what the original place name probably was, and then you can start to see how these places may have developed over time. Up in Cumbria and Lancashire are lots of hints of the landed Viking aristocracy, these wonderful sculptured stones. This is the Viking Age burial site at Cumwhitton. And the one thing that probably unites all of these, the hidden clue in this slide, is that none of these names are Viking Scandinavian names. Even Lowther, which some people think was Viking, is actually an old British or old Welsh name. Cumwhitton, Hesham, Halton, they're straightforward Old English names, Gosforth. And this contributes to a view which I took in the book, and I've written about this, that the incoming Scandinavians in the 9th and 10th centuries, their initial tactic was to take over, either by purchase, negotiation, or perhaps in some cases by conquest, existing estates. And they didn't change the name of these estates. Most of the Viking stone sculpture that you'll find in places like Cumbria is located in parishes which preserve their British or Anglo-Saxon names. It's just a couple of places that have Viking names. And similarly, the settlement sites that we know of, this is probably a later Viking to medieval settlement in Cumbria. The one in Wirral at Irby, dug by my good friend Rob Philpott. Hints of Viking activity, bow-sided buildings here, possibly, you know, looking at the dating, that's a 10th century spike lamp. It's on a Roman site. So where people were settling in the 10th century very much maps onto existing settlements, which again suggests that the first wave, if you like, of Viking settlers were embedding themselves in existing structures. Similarly at Galloway, one of Peter Hill's maps around Whithorn of the sculpture and place names, very strong correlation with what we know of the Roman influence in Galloway. So most of the known places where there's a Viking settlement presence, and these are not very many, it has to be said, in northwest England and southern Scotland, seem to have some kind of connection with an existing site. Only later, and Angus Winchester laid this out beautifully in his book about Cumbria, only later do you see secondary settlement in the uplands and the kind of transhumant settlements acquiring more strongly Scandinavian names there. And perhaps this was a secondary wave. There are the Galloway settlements. This is one of Richard Orham's maps, and also you can compare this to the area around Dublin, which developed as a sort of urban hinterland, and the late John Bradley has published some really amazing work on that. I have to trundle on a bit with the time. If we then take it that the Viking settlements in the various component parts of the Irish Sea were kind of somehow fitting into an existing historical geography and political geography, we can start to see that the functioning aspects of local rule, such as the assembly sites, Thingwall and Wirral and Tinwall, very famously in the Isle of Man, perhaps drew in groups of people and territories which already had a signature in the landscape. The Isle of Man's political geography is very interesting, very complicated. The Treens and the Quarterlands, and it does seem that there was some Viking adaptation to that. There's obviously a whole bunch of wonderful pagan burials from the Isle of Man, which I don't have time to go into, but it's all in the book. Fiona Edmonds, who's another one of our Viking Congress colleagues at Lancaster, produced this wonderful map, and this, I think, just says so much about this period. These are Gaelic or Gaelic names in the Domesday Book for Yorkshire. So this is Yorkshire itself and the bits of Lancashire that were under Yorkshire in the Domesday Book, the central parts of Lancashire. There's one particular landholder called Gilmichael who held estates in the Kent Valley and also in the valleys leading over towards York. And there was a whole spread of people with names like Gilmichael, which is a Gaelic name, in 1066. And then we obviously get two registers of information in the Domesday Book. We get the time of King Edward, so before the conquest, TRE, and this is where all of these names are mentioned. And then after the conquest in 1086, only about two survive, or three. And this is appalling. This is a massacre. This is something terrible has happened. And it seems clear to me, I'll let Fiona express her own opinions on this, that, I mean, there were some hints that some of these names may be perhaps Western Scottish Gaels coming in. I think it's more likely that these are Dublin related or perhaps Irish merchant settlements connecting the two great cities, which had become very established by the 11th century. And then in 20 years, in the horrific period after the Norman conquest, which was particularly horrific in the north, they all go. Were these people dispossessed? Did they pragmatically just change their name to something a bit Norman sounding? Perhaps one or two did. But an entire culture is being wiped off the map here by the incoming Normans. And we don't hear explicitly about what happened to these people, but where all these red dots were and where they went is a really devastating story, I think, but a very interesting one. Perhaps casts light on the earlier period of what had been going on before the Norman conquest, when these trading links seem to have been pretty active. The towns, again, there's a huge repository of information in Dublin and also Chester, and a bit later on Bristol. And these become an arena of cultural change in themselves. You can see lots of metalwork similarities between the material culture, huge excavations in Dublin, that's Wood Quay, perhaps the most famous of the excavations done by Pat Wallace. And Chester, of course, was a Roman site with legionary fortress, but it became a mercantile site in the 10th and 11th centuries. It had a mint, which in the early 10th centuries was the most productive coin mint in England. That really indicates that Irish sea trade had become a very powerful motor of change and prosperity at that time. The buildings, there are some differences around the Irish Sea. The Irish buildings, particularly well known in Dublin, the Type 1 and 2, they do seem to have some parallels in Whithorn, actually, which is interesting. Dublin's not the only early town in Ireland. It's the original, perhaps the most important, but there's also Waterford, Cork, Wexford, and Limerick as well. This is Waterford and the southeastern part of Ireland, very closely connected to the Bristol Channel. And there are these kind of more Anglo-Saxon style, if you like, sunken featured two-story buildings evident in Waterford, which are very, very similar to the types of things that we excavated in Chester. And this is taking the towns really away from the rural kind of cultural model into a whole world of cultural change and assimilation and acculturation of their own. I think you get a whole class of people known in Ireland as lost men, who were mercantile people. They lived their lives in and between the towns. They were traders, and they outlive really the political importance of the Dublin Kingdom, which falls to Irish control in the middle of the 11th century. And there's a legacy of this in these wonderful church dedications. St Olaf in Waterford. You'll see at the bottom of that church there, there's some medieval masonry. And St Olaf in Chester. A bit late in the Viking period, this building, but nonetheless, it represents the enduring kind of heritage of the Vikings in the city. This is the last slide, really. Sorry, I've gone on a little bit long. I put this up actually in a paper a few years ago. These are all the things I think one can read into to try and find out about the history of the Vikings in the Irish Sea. There's a huge list here. There's room for everyone's specialism and interest. You can get linguists, historians, geographers, you name it, that come into the picture. And we will only understand what happened here in the Viking Age by looking at all of these sources of information, and there may even be more. That's as many as I could fit into one slide. So thank you very much. That's the end of the talk.
Thank you very much, David. That was a fantastic multilingual interdisciplinary tour of the Irish Sea region. Thank you very much. Yeah, questions, please write them down in the chat. And if we are able to hang on to you for another couple of minutes, David, I will share some of those with you. Yeah, lots of thanks and thumbs up and clapping coming through as well. So I dare say that was a thoroughly well enjoyed talk. Right, couple of questions. First one was from Colin Brown. What is your interpretation of the cup and rings mark? And he says, thank you. Cup and ring marks, yeah.
Well, that's Neolithic, okay? So it's very, very considerably earlier in the Viking Age. They are seen quite a lot on monoliths and also on natural stone outcrops in the north of England and in southern Scotland and in Ireland as well. And I mean, there have been speculation that they represent astronomical or the sun or something. That's about as far as I would wish to go on that.
Brilliant, thank you. And from Mary Braithwaite, we have the question, how do long ports continue in use, earliest and later states? Do their functions change through time, for example, from overwintering sites to trading centres?
Some of them do. I mean, Dublin develops into a town, now a metropolis and the capital city of Ireland. There was allegedly but we don't know really where it was, a fort or a dun, it's actually described as, rather than a long fort at Cork. But whether it's actually in the same place as the later Viking town is a question that I don't think we've been able to fully answer. But there's certainly a later Viking town in Cork, and maybe one day someone will find the long fort of the Dun there. Others were located near to monasteries and came and went. Places like Woodstown just seem to have died out because obviously Waterford was founded downstream of Woodstown, nearer to the entry onto the Irish Sea, and that became a town. So unlike in Dublin, where you get the town really on top of where we think the Long Fort probably was, at Woodstown, the town moves a bit downriver when it's founded. And others just stay, they're empty, and they perhaps were only occupied by a couple of seasons. And they're just out there in the countryside waiting to be discovered, really. Dun Rally, if you believe that's a long fort, is an entirely deserted greenfield site nowadays, just with earthworks.
Thank you. I've got all sorts of thank yous and congratulatory messages on a wonderful talk. Lorna Carter has written, is it time to reassess hogbacks as cross-cultural developments with British cultural roots, which happen to map onto the Danelaw? But we do have a talk coming up on hogbacks on the 28th of August, which I'll be presenting, so stay tuned. But yeah, I think that was a really interesting point about
well, hogbacks, yeah, I could have spent the hour talking about those, really. Very interesting monuments, quite puzzling in many ways. And I think Victoria Whitworth is currently heating up a great sort of theory about them, which I'll let her explain. She may be your speaker that you refer to. One of the difficulties is everyone assumes that they're grave monuments, and some of the perhaps later ones in places like Luss on the shores of Loch Lomond or in Papawestray in Orkney are in graveyards. But were they originally grave monuments?
Yeah.
Hardly any of the ones that I know best in northwest England were found in direct proximity to a burial, but they surely must have been. They're nearly all associated with churches. Some of them, ones in Cumbria around Gosforth, that kind of area, are absolutely brilliant. The one I showed in the map of Lowther has a Viking ship on it. So if nothing else, they're expressive of an incredible range of art, which is very, very inspiring and interesting to look at, really. But you know, the classic hogbacks from places like Brompton in Yorkshire are phenomenal. And what were they there for? I think they owe something to Roman monumentality, actually. There's people forget that in the Roman period, you go to a museum in Chester or Carlisle, you'll see these. There's a great tradition of stone monumentality, of funerary monumentality. And I think hogbacks, which you don't get in Scandinavia, are some kind of adaptation to that.
Thank you. I might make this our sort of final question here from Patricia Crowley, who's asked about the other Vikings of the Irish Sea, all from the same Scandinavian origin, in brackets Norway. How culturally similar were Normans to these early Vikings? And is there genomic testing done on any findings of on Vikings of the Irish Sea?
Again, very important, and kind of could be here for a while talking about this. Surprising, I mean, there has been work done on burials from the Viking world. I mean, people will be familiar with the famous case of the burial from Birka in Sweden, which was thought to be a male burial. It's a warrior burial, turned out to be female once the DNA was done, and that led to a huge kind of outburst of chatter on the airwaves. And there's been isotope work done in Orkney and Iceland. There's plenty of work up there being done on, and this is helping to understand the population of Iceland was very far from being just a bunch of Norwegian Vikings. And the Norwegian, yeah, there were some Norwegians, but they weren't dominant, actually. There were people from all over Western Europe. The Viking warband was an eclectic body of people who shared a kind of lifestyle and perhaps an allegiance to each other, but it wasn't an ethnic thing. And this has been, there's a whole thing about scholarship and nationalism and culture history, which has led to our view of the Vikings as being a kind of Scandinavian colonial force, which I actually disagree with, even though it's hard not to say that there were some important Scandinavian traits in there. I'm struggling to think if, I mean, there are burials from the Isle of Man, from Peel, obviously burials from Dublin, which could be tested. We have some human remains, particularly from the more recently excavated ones. The 19th century stuff, you just get the weapons, really. And I just think we're at the start of this story. I don't think much work has been done yet, and it needs to be, really.
Brilliant. Yeah. And like you say, perfect place to end it, because look at that list of potential areas of further discussion and exploration. So I just want to wrap up by thanking you again, David, for your time this evening, and everybody for all your questions. I'm aware there's many more and many other messages and comments, and I'm happy to pass those on to you, David, after the meeting.
I'm reading them
lots,
now, actually. Someone
yeah.
Govan.
Yes, lots of interested participants. But yes, thank you everybody for
Yeah, I
bearing
mean,
with us.
Govan is an important site, which is another place that you could spend an hour at least talking about, and it's got hogbacks, and it was probably part of the Kingdom of Strathclyde. But I hope everyone enjoyed it, and thank you for asking me.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much for coming along. I hope to see you all at our next talk. I'm just going to quickly share a link to that in the chat here. Dr. Neil McGuigan will be speaking to us about 12th century Orkney. But in the meantime, please have a great rest of your evening. And I know I'll be buying a copy of Vikings of the Irish Sea Revisited. So everybody have a great evening, and thank you for joining.